Our fifth video here for our spring break series, and we're picking up now with the prosperity of the 50s. So Eisenhower's domestic legislation was very modest. The country enjoyed a steady growth under him. We had very low inflation in the 50s at 1.5%, so things were going really great. The federal deficit fell in relation to national wealth. So the deficit goes down in the 50s and national wealth goes up. Between 1945 and 1960, the per capita disposable income of Americans more than tripled. So the 50s is seen as one of these great times of prosperity because it was. We had such a great, standard of living after World War II. Many Americans are able to afford so many more things. They had a lot more disposable income, could buy all kinds of different things they wanted to as a result. So the post-war economy gave the U.S. the highest standard of living as a result in the world at that point. And like I said, by the late 50s, 60% of Americans live in suburbs now. So by 1960, 60% of Americans live in suburbs because they can afford to, right? They can afford to take a car or take a subway train or whatever, a tram, into town and go to work. Now with interstate systems and so forth, they can move out of cities and move into suburbs and take those interstate systems in the cities to go to work now. So all that allows for more growth because people have more money in general too. And all this is due to our post-war booming economy after the World War II ends. Just to briefly mention the 56 election, there's not much to say. Eisenhower had suffered a heart attack in 55, and he had surgery. Because of that, the Democrats tried to make this an issue for his second term. They, in fact, ran Adlai Stevenson again in 56 as well. But after 4 years of peace and prosperity under Eisenhower, Ike was still very popular. And so they ran the I Like Ike campaign again, and he wins. So Eisenhower wins again for his second term. The Democrats still control both houses of Congress, but Eisenhower won by even a larger margin against Adlai Stevenson in the 56 election. Okay? So as far as domestic policies go, outside of which we haven't gotten civil rights yet, civil rights will come later on. There was a lot of prosperity, a lot of good things that happened under Eisenhower, and not a whole lot of acts and things to talk about in that regard. So we're going to go now is Eisenhower and the Cold War. This is where we get a little more action with Eisenhower. Most of his attention as president was on the Cold War. The very experienced diplomat who he had helped shape his foreign policy was his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who's the old man right here. John Foster Dulles was the guy who helped shape a lot of his foreign policy for the Cold War and for all foreign policy in general. So Dulles criticized Truman's containment policy as too passive. He said containment was too weak and not strong and aggressive enough. Dulles wanted a new look, a new way of challenging Soviets in China. Dulles was much more aggressive in his speeches. He talked about liberating East Europe and encouraging Taiwan government asserting itself over the communist one. So he was so assertive in the sense that he wanted Eastern Europe to revolt. He talked about even invading East Europe, us invading East Europe, which of course would have sparked a nuclear war, which nobody really wanted. And he also talked about, Chiang Kai-shek and his forces one day overthrowing Mao. So he was very much trying to provoke a reaction and trying to be much more aggressive about being hard on communists. The thing that alarmed people the most and his biggest contribution was his idea of brinkmanship, or massive retaliation, whatever you want to call it. So brinkmanship is his big idea about Cold War policy in the 50s. This is Eisenhower and his policy as far as how they see they should handle threats. So under brinkmanship, the idea is that if there's a threat by a communist country against an area we're concerned with, not necessarily the United States, but any country that we're concerned with, if there's a threat by a communist country, we're not going to retaliate with like our army and navy. No, we're going to go straight to nuclear war. That we're going to bring you to the brink of war. That's why we get the term brinkmanship. So basically it's all or nothing. You go from 0 to 60 as a result. So if there's any territory that we have interest in that the communists try to take over, we tell the communists, if you take this over, we're going to fight back with nuclear warheads. And so under Dulles, his idea was to try to spend less money on defense when it came to traditional weapons, like spend less money on the Army, spend less money on the Navy, because they cost a lot more. So he wanted to actually reduce the size of the Army and Navy, because when you pay people, you pay them for a lot longer than you pay for like a one-time missile. Instead, he wanted to increase our capabilities with jets, Air Force, and nuclear bombs, which is more of a one-time cost type deal. So decreasing more traditional warfare type weapons and increasing our spending on more modern weapons. That was his philosophy when it came to the Cold War. But it was this very extreme idea about massive retaliation. Dulles wanted greater reliance on nuclear weapons and air power. In theory, this would save money, balance the budget, and increase pressure on political enemies, because it also heightened the arms race, right? We would make more weapons, bigger nuclear bombs, and so forth, and the enemies would have to keep up. It actually does save money, because whenever you're not having to pay all these guys salaries in the Army and Navy and all these other traditional forces, it does save a lot of money. So it does help save money and balance the budget, even though we're spending more money on jets and on bombers and on A-bombs and hydrogen bombs and so forth. To some, it seemed like a policy of mutual extinction. So some people criticize this as seeming like if we did this and somebody actually did do an action, we launched nuclear bombs, they launched nuclear bombs, and everybody would be mutually assured destruction. So it's also called mutually assured destruction, mutual extinction. It's all the same idea. I'm sorry this thing keeps coming up, but get rid of that. There we go. All right. Anyway, so the policy did act as a deterrent, though. So overall, we never got under brinkmanship with Eisenhower and Dulles. We never got into a major war with the Soviets. Never got major war with China. It didn't stop minor wars happening in Asia or in Africa, or in the Middle East. But overall, the big fish, it kept at bay. So whether you like the idea or not, I mean, it really did work. I mean, because no one wanted to go to that level of war because of how devastating it would be. But so even though it was very gruesome ideas as far as promoted, it did work for the meantime. All right. So we're going to now look at unrest in the Third World. Third World, this is a Cold War term. If you ever heard of First World, Third World, Second World, and so forth. First World is like us. It's like, the upper echelon capitalism type countries. Second World is kind of like the communist world, the communist countries, so the Soviets and so forth. Third World is countries that have no allegiance to communists or capitalists, and they're not industrialized. So Third World countries are typically non-industrialized countries that have to rely on other countries for supplies. So they rely on countries like us or the communist countries for goods, and because they're not industrialized and not as developed as we are. Plus, what you also dealt with in the 40s and 50s was a lot of collapsing colonial empires. We talked about like in India and Southeast Asia, there were these collapsing colonial empires that no longer existed. Africa is the same way. There's all these colonial empires, the British and the French and the Germans and so forth, that controlled, and now they begin to fall apart. There are dozens of independence movements that happened between the 1940s and even like 1980s and 90s. Of all these countries going independent in Asia and Africa, breaking away. So like India and Pakistan broke away in 1947. The Dutch East Indies became Indonesia in 1949. And so Third World was this term given for countries that lack stable political and economic institutions, like what we had and what the communists had. And they needed foreign aid to get they needed foreign aid to be able to function, and they also were used as pawns during the Cold War. Alright, so some of the covert actions. Eisenhower's the first president to really use the CIA to its fullest potential. Eisenhower promoted more use of covert actions in like armies and navies going to attack some areas. We did undercover interventions in some countries to help protect U.S. interests. The two biggest countries we do this to is Iran and Guatemala. in Iran in 1953, the government in Iran threatened to, well, actually they did. The government in Iran seized control of all these different oil fields in Iran. Well, a lot of these oil fields were controlled by British companies because Britain at one point had controlled territories in the Middle East. And so all these British companies immediately lost all its control of these oil fields inside of Iran, which made us panic because now we're worried that all of this oil might be cut off to us. And we were realizing how important foreign oil has become in the 1950s. And they had this type of, they had a republic. They had a democracy in charge of them where they had people went elected and so forth. And they decided to nationalize this oil. Well, we didn't appreciate that. So what we did is that Eisenhower sends in the CIA to secretly supply a revolution there to overthrow the government. So the CIA goes in, and we don't fight. Like, none of our guys actually do the fighting, but we supply weapons, we supply money, we supply help to the side that helps overthrow the government. And as a result, we reinstate this king who had been disposed a few years before. His title is called the Shah of Iran. I have it on here. Shah. His name was Reza Pahlavi. You only know that, but his title was the Shah of Iran. So what we did was we got this king who had been disposed a few years before back into power. So the Shah of Iran gets put back into power by the revolutionaries, by the CIA. And the reason why we like him is because he's not communist. We also worry that the government that was in charge of Iran might follow the communist influence. He wasn't communist, and he was pro-U.S., so he would continue to trade with pro-U.S., and he would continue to trade with Western powers in general, because he would also help the British to keep the trade going too. So again, that shows you our idea about the Cold War. The Cold War, we're not trying to stop, we're not trying to help democracy spread. What we're trying to do is make sure that countries stay pro-U.S. And so by doing all this covert action and so forth, we make sure that Iran stays pro-U.S. And so from the 1950s to the 1970s, the Shah stays in power. He helps to westernize Iran. He helps to trade oil with us. But at the same time, he's very oppressive to his people, rules like a dictator, and is not very kind to his people. But we'll come back to that later on in the last unit. Actually, in Unit 12. The other area we did the covert actions in was Guatemala, and this is in 54. There was a new leftist government that was coming into power in Guatemala in 54. We worried that it might be a communist takeover there. We were uncomfortable with the idea of having a communist government so close. Guatemala is in Central America, and we didn't like the idea of having a communist government that close to us. So with Guatemala, we sent in the CIA again, because what the government was doing was they started to seize control of private property. They started to distribute to the people, the peasants inside their country, and they begin to have very leftist views or leftist ideas and so on. So we sent the CIA and again, we funded a revolution there as well, again, and we helped the military overthrow the government, and it installed a general as a dictator. So this general became the dictator of Guatemala as a result. Now, he, of course, was very brutal and gruesome to his people, and he was not very kind, but he was pro-U.S. trading. He was not communist, and that's what we preferred. Okay, and so both Iran and Guatemala is where we see the CIA used by Eisenhower and his administration to go in and make sure these governments stay in power that we prefer. So we're going to stop the 5th video there.